Welcome to the world's meeting place. American.
Practically narcotics.
Freedom.
Oh, yes. I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Welcome back to this special MLK Day edition of Truth Jihad Radio. I'm Kevin Barrett. We're talking today about domestic assassinations. You know, there are lots and lots of foreign assassinations. They've assassinated millions of people in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere over the past decade. But what we're talking about today is the American political assassinations that make these genocidal mass murders possible. That is the murder of American politicians like John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and political leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., people like Senator Paul Wellstone, who stand in the path of the war machine bulldozer and get bulldozed. That's pretty much what seems to happen. And it seems to me that there's no reason why we should be letting this happen. You know, traditionally, when good people with a big following get taken out, well, they're following, you know, those people pick up the pitchforks and the torches and go after the bad guys. And I say, we're better do that. You know, next time this happens, if they ever, God forbid, kill off another inspiring leader, somebody like Ron Paul, for example, let's burn this whole country to the ground and start over, because it ain't worth preserving at that point. It's just not worth pretending that we have a livable, acceptable country if we're going to let this kind of stuff happen. And these wimps, these so-called liberals and leftists and progressives who let the fascists murder their leaders every time a decent, charismatic leader arises and they get shot down, and then the progressives and the liberals hide their heads in the sand and say, well, it's just a conspiracy theory. Don't worry about what really happened. Those people are not worth their body's salt. I mean, they're worthless. They're scum. They're a complete disgrace to the human race. You know, if you like Paul Wellstone and they shoot him down, you goddamn well better get a gun and shoot down those bastards that did it one way or another. I'm not necessarily talking straightforwardly and literally. I'm talking about making it happen. It's not acceptable. Wake up, people. Okay, well, my guest this hour is somebody who is in the business of helping people wake up to these realities. His name is Roy Harvey. He works with Snowshoe Films. It's one of the rare media outlets that's out there looking for and telling the truth and telling it without compromise. Roy Harvey has helped put together this great new film about the Paul Wellstone assassination. It's called Wellstone. They Killed Him. And I guess that's pulling no punches, but that's what they do at Snowshoe Films. They'll tell you the truth straight out and hopefully educate enough people to make sure that this horrific chain of events in which every time a great, potentially great American leader arises, he gets shot down, is finally going to have to end someday. Well, welcome to the Martin Luther King Jr. Day edition of Truth Jihad Radio. Roy Harvey, it's good to have you. How's it going, Roy?
Hello, Kevin. It's good to be on. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. You know, this whole issue of domestic assassinations of the good guys just really tees me off. You know, it's how can people not face the reality that this is unacceptable?
Yeah, that's right. We first were aware of the sort of indifference of the left on the day after he was assassinated, October 25, 2002. We were in Washington, D.C. when we heard it on the news that Wellstone's plane went down in bad weather and so forth on the morning of October 25. And there was a major demonstration in Washington, D.C. on that day to try to stop the war. And we looked for people who were upset about this, people who from Minnesota, because people were all from all over the world. And we didn't find but one person out of thousands of thousands. And the idea of entertaining the notion of assassination or foul play just didn't cross their mind. And part of that was that the whole 9/11 had just happened, and the inside job or the outside job is what I think it is. What didn't cross their mind either. So they weren't going to entertain that their senator, the leading progressive senator, was murdered.
And this is so mind-boggling because anybody who knows anything about history knows that assassination is a major tool of people seeking power. And, there are a lot of clear-cut cases, Julius Caesar and so on, and there are a lot of less clear-cut cases. But just to ignore the possibility, especially when the circumstances are such as they were around the Wellstone assassination, my goodness. I mean, here we have Cheney basically threatening him the week before, and here's a guy who's standing between the Bush administration and this war in Iraq that they clearly are going all out to get. I mean, how much more obvious does it get?
Absolutely. One of the things that really caught our attention was this is a very public assassination. I mean, you were just talking to William Pepper about the heart attack and Look magazine. The thing is, this could have been done very carefully and quietly with a heart attack or, something else. But yet it was done very publicly. And
they got his family, too.
Family, 2 pilots, 3 aides, and, the plane, the circumstances of the plane. It was burned for 7.5 hours. The FBI was on the spot just shortly after the EMTs were there. And the EMTs were only about 3 miles away, so you can see how fast they were there. And the question is, why were they there so fast, and what was going on? And clearly they knew this was coming down. That's our assessment. But it was a very public assassination, and
And that sends a message, doesn't it? The same thing they did to both JFK and Lee Harvey Oswald, the patsy. And, they actually had Oswald taken out on live TV from Dallas police headquarters. Do you think that they choose these public scenes for their executions in order to send a sort of half-subliminal message, don't mess with us? Or? I
think it was a very overt message, not too subliminal. The people in the Senate and the House knew that Wellstone was asking questions about 9/11. That was all around. You don't ask those kinds of questions for that story, not to get back to Cheney and this executive assassination ring that Seymour Hersh talked about in 2009. So it was a very public assassination, I think, and the reason is they didn't want any questions about 9/11, and he was beginning to ask them as we interviewed various people that, said that. Some would not say it on camera, and we know a great number of people who are cognizant of this, but they're terrified for their lives, so it sort of stops there. But
right. Senator Barbara Boxer is, sort of semi on the record with saying, I think the direct quote was, the Wellstone assassination was a message to us all.
Right, yeah. Yeah, there was a point where she was actually going to speak. 4 Hours, one of the co-authors with Jim Fetzer of his book American Assassination, she was beginning to, actually consider a public investigation, but backed away rather quickly.
Right. Yeah, it's somehow people seem like they're not willing to take the kind of risks that so many people throughout history have. I mean, anybody who wanted freedom or was resisting an unjust invasion of their territory or just standing up for justice or for what was theirs in so many different ways, people have risked so much and, suffered so much. And here in the USA, it seems like, nobody's willing to, even shave a couple of years off their life expectancy by taking a relatively small risk.
Right. Well, when you look very closely at this thing, I mean, there's a factor that we didn't cover in the film, a couple of factors that we left out because we didn't have we tried to get 2 or 3 sources. Our background was journalism before we retired, and so we didn't do it, but it's important to actually talk about those. Do you want to go down essentially what we did in the film? It's basically...
let's do that.
Okay. It's 15 chapters. The first chapter we devoted to essentially examining who Wellstone was, because a lot of people just don't know why they would go about trying to assassinate or assassinating this guy and taking out his family.
And that's probably true of many of our listeners, too, because this is a national and international show. Here in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, we know about Wellstone and how he was the leading pro-peace and progressive senator, and he was standing in the path of the war to Iraq. But many people elsewhere haven't really appreciated just how important Wellstone was.
Right, of course. And the big thing is it flipped the Senate in Bush's favor, and that was a key factor. And then Wellstone was never fully on board in our investigation with the full Israeli agenda. And when you look at who's pushing for the war in Iraq, who was pushing for the war in Iraq, and who is now pushing for the war in Iran, and who and what, Wellstone was Jewish, and is one of our major leaders who had the capacity to stand up to essentially this agenda to get us into war. And he voted along with 22 other senators to oppose the war. But that wasn't the reason, because he'd already voted. There were a multiplicity of reasons. And I think the primary back to it is 9/11. I mean, that is the key. We don't want anybody looking into that. And
if anybody of the stature of a U.S. senator ever really stood up and started telling the truth about 9/11 or talking about needing a real investigation, just think of how big that would be.
Yeah, right, and that's where it was going. So that's what we did on the first chapter, was explore the phenomenon of the Iron Range, why it was killed there. One of the things that we really didn't start filming it until 2003, and then we went straight to Duluth and spoke to Jim Fetzer, and had, of course, contact with Four Arrows. We spent 4 or 5 ventures out there. We're from New York State, and we interviewed as many witnesses as we could. Some wouldn't talk. They had heard shots. But essentially what we found is that every one of the witnesses were intimidated by the FBI. And the FBI did almost all of the investigations. And then much of that data that they collected wasn't in any kind of report. It just vanished. And it isn't in the NTSB report, which was produced about a year later. Their approach was to downplay any evidence, just talking to these guys, no questions. There were a whole lot of questions one might ask. For example, there were shots heard by 3 independent witnesses, and we only covered 3. We didn't have, we have subpoena power, and none of that data was in the report at all.
So the shots were heard in just gunshots? Well,
it was described by a principal who was there. This was hunting season, and he was out scouting some hunting area for deer, and the very day, October 25, and he heard this very high-powered shots come from the plane. Apparently, what happened was our assessment, and that's essentially the assessment of Fetzer and Foros, Don Jacobs, a professor in Arizona, was that these explosions that these 3 men heard, shots or high-powered something or other, was this one fellow said it was a 50 caliber shot, and he's a fairly competent hunter and knows his weaponry. That and others who had similar things, we assessed that it was probably an electromagnetic pulse sort of weapon that took this out. And the reason the plane out, and there's just a whole lot of corroborating evidence for that. For example, 10:18, a fellow's cell phone acted strangely at exactly the moment. The plane essentially went off radar. The NTSB lied about how high this plane was at 5 miles out. When it flew over this fellow's house at 5 miles out, he could see the plane was flying sideways, no lights, it barely missed the trees, the crows flew up in the air, and he'd never, ever heard of seen the plane that close to his house, right over the trees, with the engine spooling down. This is a turboprop, and it was clearly going to crash, and within, I think, 2 minutes, or less than 2 minutes, it did crash beyond his house, just 2 miles short of the runway. And the NTSB and the FBI, of course, covered that all up. I mean, and similarly with other witnesses that wouldn't go on camera with us. So
again, they make it. What was the connection between the explosions or gunshots and the use of an electromagnetic weapon?
Well, what happens apparently, and we've talked to one of our contacts or one of our subjects in this thing was an Australian physicist who had a good background in electromagnetic weaponry, and what would happen is electronic equipment on board the plane would explode, and this would cause loud shot-like sounds. And this plane was essentially going right over their houses and exploding internally, in all probability. and because it had no running lights, it was flying about 65, 70 miles an hour, apparently, just missing these trees. And the probability is that that's what they heard.
And so this plane was obviously in so much distress, and yet the crash was ultimately blamed on pilot error, as if they just took it down too low before they got to the runway. Yeah, too low, too slow, and just crashed. And it was just the pilots ignored everything, ignored their instruments. There were two pilots. This plane was only required to have one pilot. They were very competent pilots. There was no mayday, no signal of distress. And about 10:17 or so, just before this apparent hit, there was a statement made by the NTSB that the plane was not had no indication of any problem. So, it was just a sudden thing. Lost all contact with anyone and just, glided to a stall and then crashed into the woods. And then burned for 7.5 hours. And as you probably know, it melted the fuselage entirely. And that's a strange aspect of this fire. Jim Fetzer talks about this in his presentation and I guess in the book as well, that you would expect the fire after a plane crash would happen where the fuel is, which would be the engines, fuel tanks, out on the wings, fuel lines. But instead, this fire left all that stuff intact and somehow basically burned up the aluminum of the fuselage. Not only aluminum, but magnesium wheels. Mm-hmm. It burned these metals that really take temperatures of 2,500 degrees. I mean, it melted all the copper. It melted everything but the steel. And of course, one wing was up against a tree, and fuel had burned, it leaked out. And the other wing was lying a little ways from it, and it was totally intact and ripped off. And of course, kerosene burns at black smoke. And this smoke was identified by everybody concerned as bluish-white smoke. Okay, and we'll talk about the significance of that after the break. I'm Kevin Barrett talking with Roy Harvey about the Wellstone assassination. Stick around.
Just look at us. Everything is backwards. Everything is upside down. Doctors destroy health, lawyers destroy justice, universities destroy knowledge, governments destroy freedom, the major media destroys information, and religions destroy spirituality. I think there's more to know here.
What you hear about in this country are differences. That's all the media and the politicians are ever talking about, the things that separate us, things that make us different from one another. That's the way the ruling class operates in any society. They try to divide the rest of the people. They keep the lower and the middle classes fighting with each other so that they, the rich, can run off with all the money. Fairly simple thing happens to work. If you know anything different, that's what they're going to talk about. Race, religion, ethnic and national background, jobs, income, education, social status, sexuality, anything you can do, keep us fighting with each other so that they can keep going to the bank.
Welcome back. This is a special Martin Luther King Jr. Day edition of Truth Jihad Radio. I'm your host, Kevin Barrett, talking about the significance of political assassinations in America, and specifically the fact that when people stand up for truth and justice and start getting a following and they have some charisma, well, watch out. They better duck. It's happened too many times, and I don't think we should put up with this anymore. But before we all get mad enough to do something about it, we have to get the truth out about what's really been going on in our history. And that's what we're talking about today. First hour, I talked with William Pepper, attorney for the King family, who proved that it was U.S. government agencies that murdered Dr. King. And right now I'm talking with Roy Harvey. He's with Snowshoe Films, and his film is called Wellstone. They Killed Him. And it's a great, great movie, highly recommended. So before the break, Roy, you were talking a little bit about the evidence that this was an assassination, presumably done with microwave weapons. And there is all sorts of contextual evidence that these extremely high-level political assassinations often happen by way of plane crashes. John Perkins, author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, has talked about this. He actually knows some of these professional assassins because he was working in tandem with them. He would be sent by the big banksters to talk to heads of state and twist their arms to take usurious loans that would basically put these countries in hock to the international banksters for eternity. And if the leaders didn't go along with it, he would say, well, I've got a fistful of $100 bills in this hand and a fistful of bullets in the other hand. Which one do you want? And if they turned him down, well, John Perkins would go home and the banksters would send in the asteroids. The asteroids are these high-level political assassins. And more often than not, the leader in question would go down in a plane crash. So we know by this direct testimony of somebody who was involved in this, John Perkins, that these plane crashes are the most popular kind of political assassination. And so when something like this happens to Wellstone, you have to take this as a very likely case. I mean, you really need to have the burden of proof being on those who claim that it's not. And in this case, of course, the whole investigation was run the other way.
Yeah, you bet. There needs to be certainly a real public investigation. And in this case, the NTSB holds investigations only in high-profile cases. And this didn't qualify as high enough profile.
Yeah, well, ranking U.S. Senator, the whole balance of power in the Senate rides on his campaign that's coming to a head in about a week or so,
Right,
2 weeks.
Exactly.
I mean, he's the one guy standing between the Bush administration and an invasion of Iraq, and this isn't a high-profile case.
Right.
Oh, boy.
What they tried to do at first, of course, because I think what's going on is there are two audiences on an assassination like this. There are the people in the Senate and the House. We want no questions on 9/11 in this case, and Wellstone is going to be murdered, very high profile, and people get the message. But on the other hand, you've got the general public, and you've got to keep it quiet with regard to them, and so you've got to develop all sorts of a strategy or lies or some other reasons for why this plane went down. And of course, it was said that it was icing. It was various other things that they articulated. But we have the UPS pilot that came in just 30 minutes before Wellstone's plane was due to land. His name was John Tunin. He flew UPS planes, and it's a very similar plane to the Wellstone plane. It's which his was a turboprop. And he had no problem landing, so that knocked that hole out of the water, and they had to come up with another reason, which, of course, is why they went to pilot error.
Right. And I think that's very interesting, the way you suggest that there were sort of two messages being sent. One message to the political leadership, and especially the Senate and the House members, and the other message to the broad general public that wasn't really paying attention. So the people paying attention know it's an assassination. The people who don't. This fits right in with neoconservative methodology. Leo Strauss, the guy who founded neoconservatism, who was actually kind of a neo-Nazi philosopher, taught that all texts should be read and written in this way. One vapid, lying message to those who are not in the know, that is the masses, and a special secret message sort of to those who could read between the lines, to those who knew what was going on.
Right.
And that's, I think, what you're suggesting, the kind of message that the Wellstone assassination sent to Congress. And
you know what? One of the interesting things here, you have the FBI within probably about 12:30, and the plane went down about 10:30. So 2 hours after, you have an assembled FBI crew, which is up to 15 men, combing the whole area. The rescue team, which there was nothing to rescue, were there, and the fire was raging, and they were confined to the plane itself, and then the FBI runs the whole thing, freezing out the local police. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon that the FBI and the Capitol Police and a whole bunch of others were there 8 hours before the NTSB shows up. And, of course, you know that the NTSB can't rule foul play. The Attorney General has to rule if there's a foul play, and then the NTSB steps aside, and the FBI takes over, because the problem what you had was about an hour or two after within that evening, the FBI said there was no foul play in this assassination, in this plane crash. And yet the plane had not stopped burning. There was no possible way that they could have determined that. And when you consider this 2002 October, this was at the height of hysteria. Ridge is doing everything he can. Ashcroft is doing everything he can to create this hysteria. But they said, no problem, no foul play. It's just outrageous. That's what clued us into the probable assassination. And then, you look further and you see all sorts of other reasons.
And just out of curiosity, what would be the FBI's jurisdictional reason for even appearing at this crash site, much less appearing there faster than they should have been able to get there?
Well, they have none. There was no, they should have been there as an investigative team because it's a senator and it's a high-profile...
Right, a potential crime scene.
Yeah, potential crime scene, but it was not ruled as it was ruled not a crime.
So they basically showed up there to rule out.
And they interviewed all the witnesses. I mean, that's extraordinary. NTSB, Carol Carmody's there, and sometimes with the FBI, but the ones who intimidated and brought in were FBI, and the ones who interviewed this principal who heard these shots and so forth. The FBI did the interviews, but it doesn't appear in the investigation.
Wow.
There's another factor. Let's see. Yeah, another factor that was extraordinary, and we ran into it when we went out there. But before I get to that, you spoke about the sloppiness of these people, and it really testifies to their sloppiness because they left all sorts of debris. We went out in 2004, I think it was, or 3, to the crash site, and we picked up scads of metal. It was molten metal all over the ground. They didn't even clean up the mess they made. They just, lied and then got out of there.
Yeah.
And we could pounds and pounds of just molten, dripping metal, which it came from apparently the fuselage.
I understand that some tests were run on that.
Perhaps they were. We had physicists look at it, and they said that there was no way this could have come from a conventional fire, especially when you consider kerosene-based jet fuel. I mean, fuel is not going to reach these kind of temperatures that are going to melt this fuselage.
Shades of the World Trade Center demolition. Jet fuel fires doing amazing things.
Absolutely. It's incredible. And, what's required is a kind of dumbed-down American, and that's what they counted on. When we went out, we'd go talk to people, emergency medical technicians and various others. No police would talk to us because they were told to shut up, and they did. But they would all say, we're not like that up here. We don't believe in conspiracies. And that was just the sort of the mantra that came out of the people that were integrally involved in this thing,
Wow. But the ordinary people of Minnesota more or less do believe in conspiracies.
Right.
I mean, you talk to a lot of folks, and the title, Wellstone, They Killed Him, seems to pretty much sum up what you were hearing from a whole lot of ordinary people.
Absolutely. I mean, there was a poll done about who possibly did. I think Jim, I think it was the Minneapolis Star or whatever, they ran a poll, and the bulk of the people said that they thought, given choices that were available in terms of questions.
Yeah, bad weather, pilot error, Republicans.
Right, and they said Republicans,
I thought it was amazing that a mainstream newspaper would run, they would even take a poll that was phrased that way, much less run the results.
Rather brave of them. There's another factor here, too, with regard to this electromagnetic pulse theory, and that is that there was a white van, a very late model white van, that pulled out of the very area. There was a back road, county road, at a speed of about 75 miles an hour, taking corners that would have turned over a van if it wasn't an expert driver. And we had a witness, actually 4 people who saw this van and followed the van down this dirt road, which was very similar to where one of the witnesses heard. It was actually 2 miles away from the crash site, or close to that. And this white van, fleeing at a high rate of speed out of the area from which the shots were apparently fired, was never part of any kind of investigation. No questions, just nothing, So there are all sorts of loose ends. And there's another aspect that we found extraordinarily interesting, and that was the first responders were contained and entertained by the FBI. We call it schmoozed. They just there was a mantra that all of and these were good, decent people who have their hearts in the right places. They were saying, "Oh, the FBI, they were just such wonderful people. They liked us. They really cared about us, and so they have an entirely different attitude, the same FBI people, toward witnesses. Intimidate them, undermine them, attack them. And we had witnesses who were basically driven out of the state because the local police were just harassing. So there's two different approaches that they have, one toward witnesses, one toward, first responders on the scene.
It's interesting. I've had Colleen Rowley on this show. She's the 9/11 whistleblowing FBI agent who was shot down metaphorically when she went to FBI headquarters to try to get permission to look at the laptop of Zacchaeus Moussaoui, the very strange character who was begging flight schools to teach him how to fly, but he wasn't interested in taking off or landing. He just wanted to be able to steer, and he was ranting about being a fan of bin Laden and that sort of thing. And so Colleen Rowley put in a visa request to get a sneak peek at his laptop, and thousands of these requests had gone through, and only one in history had ever been rejected or something like that. Mm-hmm. But they rejected that one, so that might have blown the cover on 9/11 by showing that Moussaoui was a patsy or whatever. Anyway, she was Woman of the Year. She was on the show a month or two ago, and she knows the FBI people in the Twin Cities, and she doesn't believe that Wellstone died in an assassination just because she apparently believes in the integrity of the Minneapolis FBI people that would have been involved in this. I mean, how do you explain this kind of lack of perception?
I think that just like many people say, there are two levels, I think, of the FBI. There are the people like Gunderson who believe in the FBI and its mission and are assigned certain areas, and then there are these squads that are assembled to do the kind of work. And so I don't necessarily think that, she may be very well right, because many of the people were very upset in the FBI office in Minneapolis that they didn't get to examine the computer that Michael Guess had. Michael Guess was the co-pilot on the plane, and he was close enough to loan this flight simulator to Moussaoui. And so there's...
that is pretty odd, isn't it? So the co-pilot on the plane that went down and killed Wellstone was linked to Moussaoui, the patsy,
absolutely,
9/11 patsy.
And not only that, when you consider that the FBI puts pressure on this guy. When the FBI comes and says, "Hey, you got a Moussaoui, he's a terrorist, on your computer, and you're giving him this stuff," you have a hold on this guy. So you've got a co-pilot who's compromised. Now, you have no idea what kind of pressure that the FBI would put on Michael Guess, the co-pilot. So you've got one other factor that's really, really important in order to get to the bottom of what happened. But, of course, it's squelched. And it's squelched at the very top of the FBI. It's not squelched in the Minneapolis office,
And that's probably the real answer to my question, is that it doesn't necessarily require that the whole FBI, all of these field agents, be corrupt. If they're operating under certain kinds of orders, it's probably easier for them to just assume that their orders are okay than to start questioning them, because if they start questioning their orders, they're going to end up like Colleen Rowley or much worse.
Right. Yep. And that's another factor about the extraordinary deceit involved with regard to claiming that there was no foul play when you have a Moussaoui question just staring you in the face and everybody, knows it. And this FBI team was not a local team. Apparently they were flown in. It's a special team that's flown in from all over the United States or wherever they are.
Okay, I think we're coming into the break. I do hear some faint music in the background. This is Truth Jihad Radio. I'm Kevin Barrett talking with Roy Harvey, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Truth Jihad Radio. I'm Kevin Barrett, talking on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day about Assassinations. Starting with the assassination of Dr. King himself. Spent the first hour talking with the King family lawyer, Bill Pepper, who won the only trial ever conducted in response to the King hit, in which the jury found that Dr. King was killed by agencies of the U.S. government and that Patsy James Earl Ray was, in fact, innocent. Right now we're talking with Roy Harvey of Snowshoe Films, maker of Wellstone, They Killed Him, about the Paul Wellstone assassination, another critically important assassination of a voice for peace and justice. And this methodology of governance by assassination, not just assassination in general, but assassination of the very best people by the worst, is really, it can't be good for the country. It can't be good for the human gene pool. I mean, this is, if you're thinking about it, why doesn't anybody assassinate Dick Cheney, for God's sake? Why doesn't anybody assassinate, well, you could just run down the list of the cowards and the scum and the psychopaths in high places. You would think that somewhere there would be somebody with martial skills that would be turning their guns against those people, but instead they shoot down the good people. I suppose the answer to why that would be is that it's the evil people doing the shooting.
And they're in charge.
Right. But it's so outlandish, and, they would be discouraged from doing this if people reacted a little more strongly. If it wasn't just one person at the demonstration in D.C. who was mad about Wellstone being murdered.
Right. One of the factors that is important in this thing is that the payout, the insurance payout, shortly after the crash, was $25 million to the families. And $1 million of that apparently went to Wellstone Action. We were thinking that Wellstone Action, which was an organization essentially created by Wellstone and continued furthering his agenda, would be skeptical. But there wasn't. There was just hostility to any kind of question that there was foul play. Not even, well, that's not totally true, because we had some people who were quietly telling us who we should interview and so forth. But the bulk of it was a payoff really worked, $25 million. And that was an extraordinary payoff, because we talked to the lawyer, Michael Guess, the deceased Michael Guess, who was the co-pilot, and he was just shocked at the quickness of the payout without any kind of contesting,
Well, I think they've learned to do this kind of, hush money thing.
Absolutely.
That's how they kept most of the victims' families from 9/11 from asking the hard questions. They paid them, $1 million plus, and it was hush money, and there were very few who did refuse to accept it, but that didn't make their lives any easier. Still, there's something really unsavory about this. They're playing on a certain kind of, human weakness in which people who take money after the death of a loved one or someone that they admired or respected, and that money is basically contingent on accepting the official version of the death, that something about human nature appears to lead most of those people to just take the money and somehow allow that to structure their worldview.
Yeah, and I think cognitive dissonance plays a role here, because once you've done that, you just disallow looking at any alternative theory, and you continue believing your own theory that it was just, as various people told us, it was just an accident. It was just an accident. Mm-hmm. Even quite a number of people had that. And another thing, too, that's really important here is that unless one gets an idea that this is possible, that their government is not under their, that's not their government as such, unless one gets an idea that they can do this, you tend not to look critically at anything. But once you are aware of any one of these assassinations, then your mind opens up a little bit, and that's why, too, is a possibility, and that's why it's so important that people look at this stuff, to prevent future ones.
Well, you would think that when Bill Pepper proved in court that it was the FBI, CIA, and U.S. Army that murdered Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that court case would stand as an official record, and that the history books and the journalists and all of mainstream society would admit that, well, okay, it's true in this case. And if they did that, though, then, of course, there would be a sort of domino effect in which all of these other assassinations would start to appear for what they really were, and people's faith in the system would be undermined, as it should be. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's why the media didn't even cover the trial of the century.
That's incredible, isn't it?
Compared to like the O.J. trial where 150 million Americans got to watch this totally meaningless spectacle, or at least meaningless to everybody but the friends of the victims. Here we have a trial that basically indicts the entire U.S. government, a momentously important trial that is absolutely boycotted by the entire mainstream media.
Mm-hmm. And there's another factor here, and that's the NTSB and the FBI apparently at the scene of the crash, which is just about 2 miles from the airport in Evelyn, Minnesota. They spent nearly 2 days looking for a CVR, a cockpit voice recorder, or a tape, or any electronic equipment that might disprove their contention that it was an accident. And then they said, we were informed by the executive heir, the owner of the plane, that there was no CVR. Well, they could have told them up front that there's no CVR. So it's just total nonsense to think that there wasn't. It was even one of the agencies said that there was a CVR on this plane, a cockpit voice recorder, and that would have told you everything, exactly when the hit happened or whatever. So it was very important to keep everybody out, the media out, the police out, anybody else who wasn't in on this, so they could find this and then dispose of them. And that's what the FBI was doing there, just eliminating any potential evidence that contradicted their lie.
It's amazing that the FBI does that they run interference for these criminals by going and cleaning up the crime scenes. But apparently this is the case. It's not the only time this has happened. After 9/11, the FBI was all over Florida, basically kicking in the doors practically of anybody who had any kind of contact with the 19 patsies and threatening them, basically telling them to shut up. And they were actually visiting these people on a daily basis. Can you imagine the FBI coming every single day and checking in to make sure that, you haven't talked to anybody, have you? I mean, this is our nation's law enforcement agency at work. My goodness, it makes, these guys are like acting like organized crime.
Yeah, and I think it is at least a two-tiered. I mean, that's our assessment over the years. We really didn't start looking at this stuff until we actually quit our jobs, not quit, but retired. But it's exceedingly important, I think, to understand the two-tiered level, at least, of the FBI. You have people, who are basically honest doing the grunt work, and then the other guys doing the cover-up.
Right. And I suppose other agencies and criminal syndicates infiltrate groups like the FBI. Jesse Ventura is famous for talking about how after he was elected governor of Minnesota, he was taken to the basement in the state capitol where he sat down with 20 CIA agents who were infiltrating Minnesota state government in various capacities. And they read him the riot act kind of and debriefed him about, how did somebody like you ever manage to get elected? Presumably to make sure that it would never happen again. So FBI agents, quote unquote, may not just be FBI agents. They might also be CIA agents whose cover is their FBI job. They might even be Mossad agents whose cover is their FBI job, or some criminal syndicate agents whose cover is their FBI job.
Mm-hmm. And there was the Capitol Police there too. There were, so they're involved in this thing too. Absolutely.
Yeah. So getting justice for Wellstone is obviously going to be a real long slog. Well, how are you promoting this film? What's the reception been? Are there public screenings? What should people know about how to get your film out there?
Well, for one, it's right now it's $20. It's a boxed thing. It has an appendix with it. We have 2 other appendixes we're working on, appendices, and they are 10 other assassinations by air. So we'll be putting that together. The film itself is essentially a product of 5 photographers, Karen, my wife, Karen Harvey, myself, and Josh Harvey, our son, and then we had 2 other photographers as well who helped out. Rukavina, a young man named Rukavina, who was the son of Tom Rukavina, who was the state rep. Wellstone was scheduled to attend a funeral of this state representative, Tom Rukavina, and it was very well known, the flight that was coming in. I mean, everybody knew that there was a flight coming in. It'd be Wellstone. It'd be where it would land. So there was no problem in setting up this thing, getting this van in there and pulling this off. And it was a sufficiently rural area so that people are not, pressing too hard for an investigation or getting there first. With regard to the film, if anybody has any information, and we spent some time out in South Dakota on this, talking with a fellow who was Wellstone himself told people that he was afraid. He indicated that he was afraid for his life no more than 10 days before the crash.
And he was threatened by Cheney at that time. I guess I would be afraid for my life if I were threatened by Cheney, too. Listen, Roy, we've reached the end of today's show. Let's send people to snowshoefilms.com, snowshoefilms.com, to learn more about and order the documentary, Wellstone, They Killed Him. Okay. Thanks, Roy. It's been great. Keep up the fantastic work.
Thanks much, Kevin.
And I hope to have you back.
Okay. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. I'm Kevin Barrett. This is Truth Jihad Radio. Back later in the week with more truth-telling alternative journalism. So, hey, until the next show, have a good one.
Online, all the time, your gateway to the world. AFR! American Freedom Radio.